All right, thank you very much, Jim.
Okay.
All right, and we will now transition. Sherry, would you like to say a few? Would you like to say a few words of introduction? And
I could. I have a few words. First, Ruth, tell me how you pronounce your last name.
Nisse.
Nisse. Okay, so Ruth is Associate Professor of English and Jewish Studies at Wesleyan University. She has her BA from Columbia, PhD University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of Defining Acts, Jacob's Shipwreck, Diaspora, Translation, and Jewish Christian Relations in Medieval England. There may be other books, but I wasn't able to research them.
No, just those two.
Okay. And she's a loyal member of Arminian, and we're so happy to have you along now that we're Zooming. We get to see you all the time, whereas otherwise you're in Connecticut and we don't see you that much.
Well, there has to be something good about Zoom, right?
Yeah, there's some. These are the
Yeah.
silver lining. And so that's it. And tonight she's going to talk to us about diaspora as empire in the medieval Hebrew deeds of Alexander the Great.
Thank you. So, Jim, are you ready with the PowerPoint? Can you do that? He's not. Oh, he's muted. Jim, can you do the PowerPoint?
I can definitely.
Okay. Okay, great. So,
You want it now or in a minute?
no, I was just asking if it was doable.
Completely doable.
Okay, great. Great. So, well, first of all, I want to thank Sherry so much for inviting me to do this, and Jim, of course, as well, and Jim Morgan, Rabbi Jim, for running this entire operation on Zoom, which is extremely impressive, really.
You never would have thought I could do it before this whole thing hit.
Well, I never would have thought anyone could do it.
Deserves of something. I don't know what it is. Certainly not wisdom, but it's something.
Well, it's Zoom, whatever.
Expected reserves of Zoom.
We've all been doing our professions on Zoom to one degree or another. So
now we're Zoomed.
Oh. Efforts roll, Sherry.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll say a few words about the Alexander romance. It's hard to overstate how popular it was in the Middle Ages. The original Greek version is called the Pseudo-Callisthenes, after Alexander's actual court historian, and it was written sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BC. But the first manuscript is from around 300 AD. So these texts are all a bit nebulous in certain ways, and a lot of them are written by people named Pseudo. There are many different variants and manuscript traditions of the Alexander romance. It was translated into Latin around the 10th century, and this set of texts are known as De Praeles, the Battles of Alexander, hugely popular. It was also translated into dozens of other versions, Arabic, into Persian, counterintuitively, and all the European vernacular languages. And as I learned at the amazing conference where I first started working on this material, it was also translated into Malay. So the story made its way to Southeast Asia. And a version of the legendary Alexander appears in the Quran as Dul Qarnayn, 2 horns. And of course, the romance is translated into Hebrew from Arabic, Greek, Latin, and other Hebrew sources. So that's just a little introduction about what this text is. Okay, so judging from 3 distinct Hebrew versions of the late antique Alexander romance, composed in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Macedonian conqueror was a popular, if unlikely, hero for medieval Jewish readers. Analogues to certain episodes in the Alexander romance appear in rabbinic literature, including the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, Midrash Genesis Rabbah, although not all of these are entirely favorable to the emperor. The rabbinic texts, moreover, do not themselves explain why the Greek fantasy version of a pagan ruler of a long dissolved empire would secure an enduring place in the medieval Jewish imagination, especially since the actual Alexander's Seleucid successors, particularly Antiochus IV, who defiled the temple in 168 BC, are remembered among the Jews' worst oppressors ever. And some medieval sources do explicitly point out this very inconvenient truth about Alexander the Great. So a simple answer to all of this is that Alexander is just fun. He's a heroic, epic figure with some superhero powers. And in the romance, he's the illegitimate son of a magician. He writes these grandiose letters to the Persian king, Darius, and he writes to his teacher, Aristotle. He fights numerous battles, he flies, he goes underwater in a kind of diving bell. He meets the Brahmins, or in the Talmud, it's Jewish sages, and also Amazons and other exotic people. And since he's in rabbinic literature, this is somewhat better for Jews to read about him than explicitly non-Jewish epics and romances. So that's a second reason. But I'd like to suggest that Alexander's Far Eastern Empire, from Persia to India, which is really embellished in the romances and has all these interesting creatures that he meets. It's this Eastern Empire that interests Western Jewish writers as a historical and ideological alternative to Rome, the great medieval enemy defined as the pagan Romans who destroyed the temple, and also Christians who are just the European, considered the European oppressors. A clue to this vision of empire is found in the 9th century Palestinian Midrash, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, that subverts the classic Jewish interpretation of the 4 empires that appear in the book of Daniel in a few places, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel 2 as a statue, Daniel's own visions in books 7 and 18. So this is the first PowerPoint. Jim. Can everyone see this? Okay, great. I can't see my paper now, but anyway, these are the four classic empires. It starts with Babylon. Babylon is conquered by Persia. Persia is conquered by Greece, which is Alexander the Great. And then the Greek Empire passes down to Rome, which is the final of the 4 empires, which will eventually be destroyed and usher in the Messianic age. So you can take that away now. Thank you.
Trying to anticipate your needs.
Yeah, no, I know. Like I said, I just wasn't prepared for how this would work.
And who knew how it would work? So
yeah, exactly. So the universal interpretation in almost universal interpretation in Judaism is that these are the 4 empires in both Hellenic texts, rabbinic texts, and Rome is the final empire. So this midrash that I'm talking about, however, lists the 10 kings who rule from the beginning to the end of the world. The 8th king is Alexander, and this is the next PowerPoint. I won't be able to see my paper, but you should see the PowerPoint first, I guess. So this would be the next slide. So the 8th king is Alexander here, who ruled from one end of the world to the other, and evidence of the book of Daniel, and his kingdom is divided. So this explains what happens with the story of Alexander the Great. And then the 9th king is the king Messiah, who in the future will rule from one end of the world to the other. So this is a kind of 5th empire. And then the 10th king is God. So what's interesting about this, this midrash is that Rome is missing, which is highly unusual. It just sort of skips from Alexander the Great to the Messiah and leaves out the entire Roman Empire. Thank you. So what's going on is the question. The adventurous and learned Alexander of the Romance tradition here becomes an eschatological figure, a figure within the narrative, the temporal narrative of Judaism. He has an inherent role in the Jewish historical trajectory. He's the king between Cyrus and the Messiah. But the Midrash pointedly ignores all of the Roman emperors. And it's, like I said, this is the universal way of thinking about empire. And this is a clue to how this gets undone. So the earliest Hebrew translation of the Alexander Romance is this thing I'm going to be talking about, the Maaseh Alexandros, the Deeds of Alexander, which appears in the mid-11th century as an interpolation to the hugely influential and widely circulated Sefer Yosephun. And Yosephun is essentially a Hebrew epitome of the first 16 books of the 6th century Latin translation of Josephus's Jewish Antiquity. So we can have the next PowerPoint slide at this point. The one before that.
Trying here. This might not work. Here, let's see if I can do it.
Is there one before that?
That one.
Oh, I thought there, is there nothing, there's nothing between those two?
This one came after.
Oh, that's the one I wanted now. Okay, sorry, it's like out of order. Sorry, everyone.
You have a human projector.
Yes, I do clearly have a human. I'm not Alexander the Great.
Exactly.
So this is just a description of what this book, the Sefer Yosephun, is. It's very strange. It's a combination of the Latin Josephus, Latin translation of Josephus, and then another Latin translation, but this one a patristic Christian one. And so it's kind of all mixed together. And it's attributed to the fictional Yosef ben Gurion. And it's an anthology. It includes different midrashic and apocryphal texts, including 1 and 2 Maccabees, translated from the Latin Bible. So the thing that's important about it is that it has various elements of Josephus's Jewish antiquities and Jewish war in it, and that it was translated from Latin. So yeah. Okay, so Yosephun fashions an account of the fall of Jerusalem that wrests it away from its Christian context at the very moment of Judaism's supersession. So it's about the fall of the Second Temple, but it's taken from this, like I said, early Christian source. So it emphasizes the Jews' spiritual as well as military resistance to the Romans. So it's marked by a kind of Christian Neoplatonism on top of everything else. And it's very hybrid in tone. And by divine judgment, the Romans under Vespasian and Titus punished the Jews for the Jewish extremists' atrocities in Jerusalem. But the Jews' series of mass suicides, culminating in the showdown at Masada, become spiritually heroic. They're infused with a kind of vocabulary of Christian and Jewish martyrdom. And the text ends with a prayer for messianic redemption, in which God will fulfill prophecies of vengeance on Edom or Esau, which are terms for Rome, and gather the Jews together in a rebuilt Jerusalem. And this is like the prayer we just said. So among the prophecies that Yosephun cites in conclusion is Isaiah 11:12. He will hold up a signal to the nations and assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So again, looking to a messianic future. So okay, back to Alexander the Great. So Yosephun has a super complicated manuscript history. It exists in 3 different redactions, and it has a bunch of different texts and interpolations. And the final one dates from the mid-12th century. And a lot of these editions are expansions on sort of epic appeal, extending the battle scenes and making this figure of Joseph ben Gurion into a kind of medieval knight in certain ways. So that's kind of cool. The medieval Alexander romance gets incorporated into the text in 2 stages of this evolution. The first interpolator adds this Deeds of Alexander text, which is a Hebrew translation directly from the Greek, and in southern Italy, 11th century. And then a second interpolator adds a prequel to this dealing with Alexander's early days, and that's a translation from Latin. So Alexander appears in Josephus itself, exactly as he does, in a sense, in Josephus's Antiquities, book 11, and the Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 69a, in this not at all historical narrative of his visit to Jerusalem. And the account in the medieval text is really deeply ambivalent, as you'll see. It combines elements from both earlier versions with many additional poetic details. And it recounts how Alexander is about to attack Jerusalem for the Jews' alliance with the Persian king, Darius. And Alexander has a dream in which a man dressed like the high priest holds a sword over his head and warns the king that God has sent him to conquer kingdoms for Alexander. Alexander then proceeds to Jerusalem, and when he sees the high priest, he falls on the ground before him. And when his completely baffled and astonished generals ask why he would bow to a man with no military power, he says that a likeness of the priest has gone before him to subdue all the nations to him. So I guess we can have the next PowerPoint at this point, which would have been the previous PowerPoint slide. Yeah, so this is what it says in this medieval Josephine version. So Alexander says to the priest, he goes into he's given a tour of the temple by the priest. And then he says, I'll have my statue erected here, and I'll give gold to the people who build it. It'll be between the Holy of Holies and the temple. The priest says, no, not so fast. We can't put a statue of you or anyone else in the temple. But instead of that, here's an alternative. We'll name all the children of the priests that are born this year Alexander, and you'll be remembered when they worship in the temple. So it reminds him that you can't put graven images in the temple. And one article I was reading that I just thought was really funny said, well, yes, and to this day, Jews do name their children Alexander. It's quite common. So I guess that's true, but I don't think it's based on this. Well, maybe it is. So Alexander then asks the priest if he'll defeat Darius. The priest says yes, he will, and based on Daniel's prophecy. And Alexander has the prophecy copied. He has the book of Daniel copied and sent to both Macedon and to Rome. And what's interesting about this is that the Rome part is totally new here. And it's weird, like why would he send a copy of the book of Daniel to Rome? Well, it's about this whole circle of empires. Yeah. Hi, yes. I can't hear you, you're muted.
I wanted to add that I remember recently being in a class where we saw a passage from the Talmud about how it says in the Talmud that there are certain garments that are worn by the priests, but they're not allowed to wear them outside the precincts of the temple. And so when Alexander came to Jerusalem, that priests had to make a copy of these garments so that they could wear the copy of the garments when they greeted in holy finery the Alexander, so that they would not violate this law that they're not supposed to wear this precious garments. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, it's one of the 3 or 4 stories in the Talmud about Alexander the Great and how the priests had to deal with him. This is a new thing to Josephine, the thing about the statue, and yeah. I mean, I think it's almost like they put it in for humor or something, because clearly it's like, of course he would want a statue of himself in the temple. How dumb can you be, right? So,
but unlike Antiochus, right? He puts up with it. He is willing to. He's willing to be persuaded. Oh, okay, fine. I'll just give tzedakah instead, and people will keep on saying prayers for me.
Well, no, that they'll name their kids after him.
That's a pretty big deal, right?
It's a pretty big deal, yeah. And like I said, this wacky article that I was reading said, oh yes, and Jews still to this day name their kids Alexander.
Yes.
They also name them Luke, though. I mean, After Skywalker, of course. not
I
not the,
haven't met too many Jews recently named Jesus, but there might still be
there's still time. Anyway, I guess we can get rid of the.
Get rid of the share. There you go.
Great, thank you. So to pick up. Okay, so Alexander emerges from Josephine's account not as a convert to Judaism, clearly, but as a king who acknowledges and even reveres his own place in Jewish eschatology, Jewish story of the end. He delivers formal blessings at the temple. He accepts the remembrance of marking the priestly class with his own name. And above all, he himself transmits the prophecy to Rome, assuring the fulfillment of the sequence of empires. And I just wanted to add one thing, actually, I was going to say is that this thing about naming the priest's kids after Alexander, I was talking to a friend about this, and we had this somewhat simultaneous idea that this was a way of substituting people for all of the cities that Alexander built. So everywhere that Alexander the Great went, he built a city and called it Alexandria, basically, including Kandahar in Afghanistan. And this would be a way of commenting on that, I think, and saying, okay, well, Jews don't have cities in the 10th century, but we can still have this memory that there are all these people named Alexander. So, I think that's probably part of it, actually. No one's written about it, so the two of us will have to write this up someday.
Virtual city.
What's that?
Virtual city.
Virtual city, yeah, no, exactly. And that's a big theme in Judaism, right? Having like the virtual temple,
right.
Yom Kippur, right? You have the virtual building.
I think it's sort of beautiful to imagine the children as being equivalent to a city.
Yeah, I think
it's beautiful too, yeah. It's, memory instead of buildings, right? It's like a more.
And I love that idea of people instead of edifices is great. It's, what really matters, right?
Well, right, because it seems to someone like Alexander the Great, it would seem less permanent, but in fact, we all think it would be more permanent. So
we're still here.
We're still here, exactly. And where is Kandahar these days? Not so good.
Rough straits.
Well, it's not what it was in Alexander's time, I guess.
And Alexandria is gone, right? So it's the one.
Yeah. Well, there were so many of them. He built city after city after city out there in Persia. So anyway, the entire passage of this visit ends with this especially ominous version of the king's demise and his division of his empire among his 4 generals. And Josephine emphasizes that what followed Alexander's reign was the 4-headed leopard that devoured the people of Judah, Antiochus. So the whole story ends up being fairly ambivalent about Alexander. The best thing about him is that he didn't insist on building a statue in the temple. Looking ahead to the Maccabean revolt, the text continues, it's only because of the mercy of God who stood in the breach and roused his priests that the memory of the people of Judah was not erased from the land. Josephine's entire account then rather self-reflexively focuses on the necessity of the transmission of Jewish texts and memory between and after empires. The figure of the multiple priestly Alexanders suggests precisely such messengers or preservers of the history of Alexander the Great. So at the point in the text where Alexander departs for Persia, this is where this interpolation, the romance of Alexander, the deeds of Alexander, appears in the text. So this is where the Alexander romance is inserted in the 11th century. So by fitting this text into the frame of Josephine, the interpolator envisages the Alexander romance in Hebrew as crucial for recovering a specifically Jewish history as its other texts, Josephus or the books of Maccabees. And that's quite a headspace if you think about it, right? That this interpolator is thinking, well, okay, so Josephus, Maccabees, the story of the Jews up to the destruction of the temple, but then the Alexander romance somehow is as important. It's something that should be in this anthology. So Alexandros is a commentary on Josephin's previous Alexander narrative and overall epic history writing. And I would say that the two texts are in conversation with each other, as in all anthologies. So Josephin and the Alexandros text, I'll just call it Alexandros, but you know what I'm talking about, the Alexander romance. We're naturally well acquainted with the idea of an eternal Roman Christian empire in the form of the Byzantine rulers who govern southern Italy at this time. And the Alexandros' time in the early 11th century, at this time, the Ottonian emperors, so the German emperors in what's now Germany and part of France, asserted a direct inheritance of Roman authority as well in southern Italy. So basically, at the time that this text is thinking about Rome, there are two different great powers claiming that they are the new Roman Empire. And at the same time, there's a renaissance of Hebrew in southern Italy, and works are being circulated among the Jewish communities there. And this is where a lot of the Piyutim, for example, are written, and other texts. So both Josephin and Alexandros are aware of the implications of the Roman Empire in these texts concerning the end of days. And the most famous of the Christian texts about the end of days is called the Revelations of Pseudo-Methodius, another pseudo, the 7th century Byzantine apocalypse that circulates extremely widely in Greek and Latin about a last world emperor, a king of the Romans who will defeat all the enemies of Christianity. And then this last emperor will move to Jerusalem, give up his crown and empire to God. So Josephin, simply by being a Hebrew account of Rome that ends with traditional Jewish messianic texts on the end of Rome, is by definition a kind of counter narrative to this Christian account. And in its conversation with Rome, the Alexander romance, Alexandros takes this idea even further. So the two translations, in very different ways, are clearly concerned with the place of Jews within the Roman Empire, both as concept and current day reality. Josephin and Alexandros testify to a desire for cultural autonomy exemplified by the Hebrew language revival in Byzantine Europe that began with new academies for Torah study. And in light of this linguistic and cultural moment in Italy, the Hebrew Alexander romance performs two functions within the frame of Josephin's narrative of the fall of Jerusalem. The main thing it does, it redirects Alexander away from both Jerusalem and Rome into the far east of India and the land of marvel. So everything that's in this romance that's fun, that Alexander goes to the east and encounters all kinds of weird stuff, becomes in this Jewish text a way of just taking Alexander out of this four empire narrative, and like the Midrash we started with, getting rid of Rome in certain ways. So it counters the Roman annihilation of the Jews at the end of Josephus, Josephin with a vision that emphasizes Alexander's empire at the expense of Rome. So the Alexandros expands Alexander's empire in ways that challenge the Roman victory over Jerusalem through the conqueror's encounter with an autonomous diasporic Jewish realm in the distant east. And the reception of Josephin suggests that it was read together with the liturgy of Tisha B'Av in the Middle Ages as a kind of historical background for the Lamentations of Jerusalem. The Alexandros points to a completely different strand of reading, one that provides diaspora Jews with a more defiant and geographically completely different and open-ended narrative. So, in the original Greek Alexander romance, Alexander, having defeated the Persian heads, the Persian empire, heads off to fight Porus, the king of India. On his way, he stops in the land of the blessed, which is without sunlight. Two birds with human faces appear and, speaking in Greek, tell Alexander to turn back. He cannot conquer the land of the blessed, which is God's alone, even though he is destined to rule India. So we have the 5th PowerPoint here. Great, okay, so in the Hebrew version of this, it's slightly different. Alexander arrives in the place of darkness, and he wants to see the generations called Makari, which is Greek, blessed ones. These are the generations of Yonadav ben Rechav. And he goes in there with his army, and 2 great fowls struck him, and they have the faces of men. They speak in Greek and say, Alexandros, why are you trespassing in the land of God? You cannot see the house of God and the house of his servant. Return, for you cannot walk among the islands where the holy ones of God, Koshe Elohim, dwell. Do not compete to ascend to the height of the heavens. Alexander trembled before the fowl. So this is one of Alexander's great failures. And I think we can go back to me and my paper. Thank you. So with these additions, the Hebrew translator reworks the romance into a midrash on Jeremiah 35, which is the only biblical passage that mentions the mysterious Yonadav and his descendants. But above all, an alternate second temple, the house of God that Alexander had apparently left behind him in Jerusalem, sadly without a statue, is now in this distant diasporic east. So this is the, Jim, if we could have the final PowerPoint slide. Great, thank you. So this is the only passage where these mysterious people appear, the sons of Yonadav ben Rechav. So they're ascetics. They don't drink wine, they don't build houses, nor sow seed, nor plant a vineyard, nor have one. All your days you shall dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. We have obeyed the voice of Yonadav, our father, in all that he charged us, to drink no wine, our wives, our sons and daughters, no houses, no vineyards, no fields, no seeds. So just a mysterious ascetic group. And like I said, that's the only place that they appear. So good. Thank you, Jim. This is the last PowerPoint.
You're very welcome.
No, thank you. Yeah, so the biblical Rechavites are models of obedience whom God invokes to Jeremiah, in contrast to all the other inhabitants of Jerusalem whom he intends to punish. And they reassure him that they are not like the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The prophet reports God's lesson to this family of ascetics. Assuredly, thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, there shall never cease to be a man of the line of Yonadav ben Rechav standing before me. And I should say that all I know about the Rechavites comes from a very, very thorough and fascinating article by Ronit Nikolsky. And as far as I can see, this is in fact the only article on the Rechavites, the only article completely devoted to them. So it's great. Early Midrashic traditions interpret them as descendants of Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, and therefore their pious converts to Judaism. Their ascetic practices are connected to future mourning for the temple's destruction. In the Byzantine Christian history of the Rechavites, however, the Rechavites are situated in faraway lands and they become messianic figures. And this is the same in the Jewish texts, interestingly, too. So there's a homily in the Midrash collection Psikta de Rav Kahana, which is from the 6th or 7th century, which claims the descendants of Yonadav ben Rechav will be the first to announce the redemption of Israel to the patriarchs and matriarchs in their graves and to bring offerings to the rebuilt temple. And another homily for the period after Tisha B'Av in Psikta Rabbati, which is also from southern Italy in the 8th or 9th century, mentions the Rechavites together with the 10 tribes banished to either side of the river Sambation And this is a famous river that's impassable for 6 days because of the fury of the water. And then it rests entirely on Shabbat. And you may or not be able to cross it then, depending on your belief system. So essentially it keeps the rest of the world away from the 10 lost tribes, the 10 tribes who aren't Judah and Benjamin, and they're all in the east. So all the Jews will be gathered together in Messianic time in Jerusalem, including the children of Yonadav, who are said to live in Sinim. And by the Middle Ages, as Nikolsky points out, Sinim can also mean China. And this is one of the qualities that makes the Rechavites appealing candidates for the Alexandros translators' fantastic Eastern text. So some critics have suggested that the Alexandros included the Rechavites as a parallel to the Greek romances Brahmins, these naked philosophers whom Alexander encounters in India, in the Hebrew text and in the Talmud, as in the Greek. The Brahmins appear after Alexander has killed Porus, the king of India. They appear as sages, Chachmim, and they criticize the conqueror's power and wealth, and they force him to admit that he is mortal. He asks them, "What do you want as a present?" And they say, "Immortality, of course." And he says, "Well, I can't give you immortality, sorry." So they said, "Well, what good are you then? You admit that you too are mortal." So both of these groups are ascetic and unimpressed by Alexander the Great. The Rechavites specifically represent a Jewish alternate narrative to the Alexander of the Josephon, that is, the transitory third emperor in the sequence from the book of Daniel. So after his visit to Jerusalem, Alexander sends the prophecy to the book of Daniel to Macedon and Rome as an indication of the history to come, the Roman Fourth Empire, and the ultimate destruction of the temple. In this scheme, the Rechavites signify the empire after Rome, a fifth empire in Jewish exegesis. But as they appear in the Alexandros, however, in contrast to these earlier Midrashic texts, the Rechavites seem completely settled in outer India. And evidently the temple is with them in the diaspora. I'll say that again. Evidently the temple is with them in the diaspora rather than in a messianic future. And so in the context of Josephon, this is a remarkably subversive idea. No sooner does Alexander claim his place in the Jewish narrative at the temple than this new text suggests that he has no real place. The Eastern Empire of the Jews is beyond his reach, and is in his impurity. He cannot physically even see the house of God and his servants, much less tour around it with the high priest. So he goes from being an emperor who can tour around the temple in Jerusalem to this guy who can't see or approach this new house of God, this new temple. So Josephon is a translation from Jewish and Christian sources. It attempts to reclaim Josephus for Jewish history. It's framed with stories about the origins of Rome from Esau, and in some accounts, Titus's resettlement of Jews in the Mediterranean. The insertion of Alexandros, though, redirects the idea of the diaspora away from a Greek and Latin Europe into the unmapped Asian territory of European romance, a territory its author would have recognized as populated by real Jews, as far east as Babylon and Persia anyway. Due to its hybrid genre, it also removes the diaspora from its usual place in rabbinic messianic narrative. The Rechavites, based on their warning to Alexander, appear already to be living in a fifth empire in Asia, even as they inform him that he will defeat India and rule in the East. So to conclude, Alexander, in the course of his visit to Palestine and his adventures in the distant East, himself becomes a figure of contradictions, at once imperial, heroic, and assimilated to a diaspora memory of Jerusalem. In his encounter with two sets of Jews, first in Jerusalem and then later in the island of God's holy ones, he is a construct of medieval European Jewish desire for an empire to counter Roman Christian power. written in the shadows of the Fourth Empire, Rome, between Byzantium and the German New Caesars. The Hebrew Alexandros looks away from Rome altogether and back to the Greek world and ahead to the next empire. Alexander the Great ushers in neither the Romans nor the rule of the Messiah, but a Far Eastern realm of Jews, whom even he, despite his conquest of the entire world, could never subject to his yoke. So that's my formal paper, and I'm happy to chat about anything I've just said and just chat in general. So thanks. And oh, I should say, you know, this is actually part of something that I wrote kind of a long time ago. And if anyone would like the scholarly version of what I just talked about that has footnotes and you know, is an actual paper and in conversation with other scholars, I can send that to you because I have a PDF.
That was wonderful. Jim Leffert wants to say something.
Yeah.
First of all, one of the reasons I've been looking forward to your presentation is because you study things that are completely apart from anything that I've learned before about Jewish history or literature. These medieval works that like that and like the Testament of the 12 of the patriarchs and everything.
Yeah.
This is new to me, totally new. And I really feel rewarded that you've presented this to us. I have two questions, basically. First of all, this journey to a Eastern location where things are different and encountering all these marvels on the way reminds me a lot of the novel Baudolino by Umberto Eco. And I'm just wondering if there's just tons of literature out there that has that as its theme and Umberto Eco was drawing upon it, or whether there might be a closer connection between what he wrote and Josephon.
That's really interesting. I haven't read Baudolino, but there are medieval texts that are much more popular. The Travels of John Mandeville, for example, where this guy calls himself John Mandeville and says that he's an English knight, and then he goes out, he goes on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and then he keeps going, basically. He goes to the Mongol Empire, he meets the Great Khan. So
I think that one of the things about Baudolino is that there's this revulsion over what's going on in Europe. And so the protagonists go east to seek something that is better and purer, and they go on this journey and they have all these vicissitudes. The other question I wanted to ask was, you mentioned about a revival of Hebrew language writing and poetry and literature at that time in southern Italy. And I wondered if you knew what gave rise to it. How did it suddenly appear? I guess that was my question.
I think that there was just more trade, perhaps, between Palestine and Italy. Well, one thing that's happening is that Islam makes it easier for Jews to practice Judaism. So the routes of transmission become easier at that point when the Middle East, or well, Palestine,
Sure, that makes sense.
Muslim, and more texts are written in Palestine, and then they're transmitted a very, very specific kind of route to southern Italy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Harriet, go ahead.
Oh, you're calling on me? Yes.
On you.
Well, I had a question about this river that rests on Shabbat, Sambatyon.
Sambatyon, yeah.
The river? Yeah, I seem to have heard that name before, and having recently spoken about, you know, Bihar, where the land rests on Shabbat, you let the land rest on Shabbat. This is a fascinating idea that the river rests on Shabbat. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about Sambatyon. I've heard that name before, I believe. Is it in
Tanakh? No.
Where does it start?
So, well, there's a river that's kind of like it that's in Pliny the Elder, actually. So I'm not even sure that it's unique to Judaism, but where it's most popular, or where you might have heard it, is the stories of Eldad Hadani, which is this whole kind of folklore that's grown up over this one character. He was perhaps a real person. He shows up, where the story is, he shows up in Egypt in the 9th century and says that he's come from, he's a world traveler, and that he's been in the East and visited the 10 lost tribes and describes them. And the rabbis have a very long discussion, letters back and forth about him to try to figure out how authentic he is. But none of that's terribly important, because people just love these stories anyway. And the idea that the 10 lost tribes are out behind this river, and in Ethiopia and Yemen, people who've tried to locate where they are. But yeah, they're behind the river Sambation, which keeps them in and everyone else out, I guess. And they also represent, they're actually really connected to this Alexander romance, because they too are this kind of military power, and they don't know anything about the Second Temple, and they don't know anything about, for example, they're described as having the Bible, they have the Torah, but not the book of Esther, because it was written too late. And they don't have the book of Lamentations, because it would make them too sad, they wouldn't understand it. So things like that they're an unconquered group of Jews who have their own military power, and they don't know anything about the Romans, essentially. So those are really interesting stories too, the whole Eldad Hadani sequence.
Yes. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sherry.
Well, maybe I missed it, but I didn't really have a clarity on what the meaning of this piece is. And if it was addressing a problem for medieval Jews and this was somehow a solution. I mean, what is the actual takeaway from this?
I think it's just a kind of imaginary escape in a way that, if you, like even in the prayers that we say, which come from the Middle Ages mostly, it's all about Rome and defeating Rome, essentially still. That we're not like other people, that there's this kind of wickedness out there, which is still in these medieval prayers, Rome and Christianity, the Fourth Empire. And we're only going to be redeemed by the Messianic era. And so it's just a kind of new imagination. It's thinking about Alexander the Great as going out to the East and what that might mean for the possibility of having Jews in other places of the world. I mean, what if there's a diaspora that's not simply the people who are left over from the fall of the temple, but are out there with their own temple and doing their own thing. So it's just kind of an imagination of a more free or open-ended world, I guess.
So
Geographical imagination.
Sort of a diaspora fantasy.
Yeah, diaspora fantasy, exactly. But involving Alexander the Great, like I said, who's sort of just fun anyway.
Yeah.
It just combines a lot of different elements, but one of them is just putting that aspect, like these Talmud stories do the same thing in a way by saying, well, Alexander was okay, he wasn't that great.
But it raises him to a much higher level than the Talmud would have.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Why?
In the imagination, he is big. And it makes, by comparison, the Romans small, because he was before them and he's really big.
Well, yeah. It's just interesting to, I mean, if you have like a way of thinking that's like this unbroken chain, there's these 4 empires, and you break the chain and say, okay, let's just forget about Rome for a while. Let's bracket that. That's a pretty radical thing to do.
So in a way, if you took it back to before or to Roman times, this was a different solution than Christianity. This is what could have happened if Christianity hadn't come along, in a way.
In a way, it's a way of just getting away from that world. It's thinking, well, there's this, perhaps there's this, I mean, I think it's like what Jim was saying, that there's this purer East.
Mhm.
I haven't read this Umberto Eco novel, although I love Umberto Eco, but I'll have to read it now.
Good, thank you.
Go ahead, Helene. You have to unmute yourself. I can't do it.
There I am I unmuted?
Hi, Helene.
You're good.
Okay, what happens to this? First of all, this is an oral tradition that gets written down, or is it? And what happens to this thread of narrative when because it has when it encounters two big obstacles to the idea of an alternative to Rome. One is Islam, and the other is the West coming into Jerusalem to conquer it. So does it hit the later Middle Ages and the Crusades and just stop?
Well, Josephine just continues to be a really, really popular book through the Crusades. It keeps changing in its different versions, but it stays a very popular account and
Of an alternative universe.
Well, actually, in the Crusades, and I've actually written about this in the book that Sherry was talking about. In the Crusades, the part of Josephine that becomes really important is its vision of martyrdom. And so
Many of those.
Yeah, a lot of the Pietim that are written after the First Crusade in Europe to commemorate the martyrs killed in the Rhineland are taken from Josephine. Some of the language comes from Josephine. So it's interesting because that Josephine's vision of martyrdom comes from patristic Christianity. So it's a very interesting cultural transfer, actually, that gets into these Pietim. You're reading them thinking that they're this kind of pure Judaism, but of course, nothing in Europe is ever pure, right? So.
And Islam, how does it fit into this genealogy of empires?
Well, that's a really good question too. I'm by no means an expert on Jewish-Muslim relations, but one thing that I was reading is that one of the people who actually goes against this four emperor sequence is Ibn Ezra, and he replaces Rome with Islam as the fourth empire.
As a empire to be diminished.
Yeah.
And cede to the Messianic era.
Yeah, so he gets rid of Rome and says it goes from Alexander the Great to the Ishmaelites, which doesn't exactly work, but he just really wanted, he was obviously angry at having to leave Spain and wanted to include Islam as the last empire. It kind of combines Rome and Islam or something. Ibn Ezra. I mean, he too has, his love-hate relationship with Islam, right? So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Anyone want to make the last question?
Is that Mikkel who's there hiding behind the screen?
It is indeed hiding behind the screen.
Can I say hi to her?
Can't hear her.
Hi, Mikkel.
Mikkel, do you want to say hi?
I guess she's not.
And reveal myself.
I want to say hello.
Yes. Wow.
Hi.
He is.
Hey, nice to see you.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Very fascinated.
Thank
It's
you.
actually I'm reading the Decameron now, so
Oh.
stories are
Good choice.
coming at me from another direction that connects the things I'm thinking about, I guess. That are
Yeah,
not very
it's funny because I've taught the Decameron for work a bunch of times, and I don't think I can face reading it again.
Well, I haven't read it since I was 18, so
Wonderful, it's wonderful. The stories are so funny.
I'm enjoying all the sex,
Yeah,
actually.
there's a ton of sex in it. That's true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. Unless there's anyone else who wants to say something, I will just thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank you too. Thanks so much. This was
And,
wonderful.
and if you want to see, if you missed something along the way, this will be on my YouTube channel. You can find it, and it'll be there in perpetuity until Google takes everything down.
so YouTube can see my hair.
Yeah.
I was thinking your hair looks great.
It looks better now than it did last week. I think it's just going to turn into like,
It'd be a mushroom.
Well, if you want to do something about it in post-production, it's probably possible.
Yeah,
Rabbi Jim,
this is one of those things where when shaving your head becomes a benefit rather than the liability, because I can still do that myself. I don't have to.
Jim, can you hear me?
I can.
Do you include the YouTube link on your Shabbat message?
I do. You can always search
For what?
Rabbi. I'm the only Rabbi Jim Morgan on YouTube.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Go to Rabbi Jim Morgan on YouTube. You will find every last video, which can be a little bit overwhelming, but I try to label them clearly so that you can find them easily.
Okay.
safety in numbers.
Yeah. I try to date them, is what I try.
Kershaw listings, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
thanks.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you all.
Everybody for coming.
Where are you, Ruth?
Connecticut.
Oh,
I want to go to Cambridge. I'm not sure I'm allowed to, though.
what do you mean?
Well, crossing state lines, right?
I don't know. I think when people come into Massachusetts, they're supposed to quarantine for 2 weeks.
Right. So I don't think I could do that at my little shoebox.
I mean, I have a feeling nothing is being enforced now, though.
Well, I don't want to.
Not bad, I don't think.
But I don't want to do anything that could potentially hurt someone.
Well, you wouldn't hurt anybody, would you? You'd be in
No.
your little shoebox and taking walks along Mass Ave and wearing your mask, and
I could avoid Mass Ave.
yeah, you could walk on any. Yes, why not?
As long as you're wearing your mask and you're keeping some physical distance, I
Right.
think, okay.
Right.
Right.
Mikkel, are you back among us or are you still among the flamingos?
No, I'm not in the flamingo zone. I'm in the zone of lilacs, French lilacs, and lily of the valley, and yes,
Are you in France?
I'm in Newton.
Well, you look very elegant, Mikkel.
Oh, that's so funny. My hair is also like, I'm really embarrassed. It's kind of like,
I know, but you see, that's what I'm saying, is that your hair looks incredibly elegant, even though.
Treat it as a new style. It's fine.
yeah,
It's
Corona.
It's called Let It Be. Just let it be, right?
yes.
Exactly.
Well, the work at home fashionistas
Yes,
are making everything even more relaxed.
yes. Ruth, if you come to Cambridge, let me know. We'll take a walk.
Yeah, I'll
Well,
probably do it in the
definitely.
next couple of weeks. I have to coordinate with my landlady because we really would have to disinfect the doorknobs every day and stuff.
Oh,
But it's not insurmountable, obviously.
right.
But yeah, let's do that.
Okay, we can talk offline about that. Good. Okay, I'm gonna say goodbye.
Somebody complains.
So
Good night. Good night.
Thank you very much.
So long, Ruth. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Carrie.
Bye-bye.